Hello and welcome to Westwind, an audio podcast about cancer, technology in medicine, and policy issues. I'm host and medical oncologist Dr. Jack West from the City of Hope Comprehensive Cancer Center in the Los Angeles area. You can find Westwind material at BeaconMedIC, one word.com, at iTunes, or just about anywhere you get podcast content. I would just ask that you show your interest and support by subscribing, commenting, sharing by telling friends and colleagues in person and on social media, and rating it however you feel is appropriate. You can also share your ideas and opinions by emailing us at westwindpodcast@gmail.com. We're continuing our discussion with Dr. Jean-Charles Soria, who is Senior Vice President of R&D Oncology at AstraZeneca and was Professor of Medicine and Medical Oncology at South Paris University, also Chair of the Drug Development Department at the Gustave Roussy Cancer Center in Paris prior to joining AZ. In 2017, you made a big career change, and with all of the momentum of what you were doing in Europe, you decided to take a role as a senior person at AstraZeneca. And can you talk about the opportunity and how you weighed that decision, both for your career plan and for how it would impact your family moving from Paris to the Washington, D.C. area?
Sure. Listen, I have always felt in life, in my professional life, that you need to grow. And when you feel you are not growing anymore, it's time for a change. In 2017, when I took the decision to move to AstraZeneca, I was already a professor for 11 years. I was a department chair for almost 5 years. And I felt that it was a good time to take a new big challenge. And as you have said, I have been privileged across all my career to work very closely with many biotechs and pharma companies and develop new medicines. And I always wonder what is exactly the job and the remit of those who are on the other side of the fence, those who are in the pharma world and develop these medicines. I joined AstraZeneca because I felt that the quality of the science that was done there was very robust, that the pipeline seemed very broad, and that there was a very clear commitment to oncology by senior management. And I was very, very lucky to be offered important job of senior vice president in charge of R&D oncology for the areas of immunotherapy, antibody drug conjugates, and cell therapy, with hundreds of people reporting to me. And yes, it was a very unique experience. You have to learn so many new skills to be able to deliver that job. I think the magnitude of the impact that you can do in that job was also one of very strong magnets to make that move. If you develop one or two drugs right, then they will impact the lives of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of patients. That seemed to me quite meaningful.
And has your family been entirely supportive? How have they found the transition? Your kids now in school in the U.S., in the D.C. area, as opposed to Paris. Has that been an easy transition where they were ready for that change, or are they talking about what they miss in France all the time?
Well, as you know, a family is an ecosystem, especially when you have 4 kids.
Yeah.
So it's very idiosyncratic to each person. I would say that, to my surprise, the ones who adapted very well to the US system were my 2 oldest, my son and my daughter. The 2 young boys are the ones who had more of a challenge because they really miss the French food compared to the American food. For them, that was a big cultural change. Especially the youngest one, Timothy, loves the French baguette, and to him was very surprising to realize that having good quality bread is not among the biggest strengths of America. He also was very surprised by the weather and powerful nature is in the United States, correct? With sometimes massive winds that will pull down trees, storms of snow that will close down roads. And he said, Dad, this country doesn't have nature under control. We should go back to France. Seems much safer. So that was an interesting perspective.
Absolutely.
And we are adapting. I mean, there is so many beautiful things that the US has to offer. I have to say, we have had very welcoming neighbors. We have had very open people. Of course, Washington, D.C. is a very international city, but we always felt welcome. The beauty of nature, the easiness of life. I mean, it's clear that one of the big contrasts between Europe and the US is that there is so much space in the US, everything is easy. When you take your car somewhere, you don't add an extra half an hour to park the car, correct? Because there is parking everywhere. That's not the case in Europe. And even the food, you can find good restaurants and the energy. I like the energy. There is, I would say, a freshness in the American way of living and the ambition of the people and the clarity of that ambition that is very refreshing.
Have you or your family gotten caught up in baseball now, which they don't have in Europe, obviously, but it's a big deal in Washington, D.C. right now during the World Series? Have your kids gotten caught up, or is this all totally foreign to them?
Well, I would say that baseball is still quite foreign, although, of course, at school they have had lots of discussions about that. I would say that they have been more infected by the virus of basketball. They like it a lot, and there is lots of actions in basketball that they enjoy a lot.
So you have had a very successful run thus far at AstraZeneca, many pivotal trials, and this is all still ongoing. What do you enjoy most about your new role? Not that new, but 2 years into it now. What do you enjoy most? And are there certain things that are particular challenges or that you miss greatly from your prior life before you entered the industry and AstraZeneca?
Yeah, let me say first what I miss. What I miss some days is seeing patients. I don't see patients anymore in this role in AstraZeneca. I could have applied for what they call an eminence license, which is given to people with big CVs and multiple publications, but I didn't felt that it was a fair compromise to just do half a day clinic in a hospital where I don't have a big connection to the patients I would see. So I have given up seeing patients on a daily or weekly basis, and that I miss because patients keep you true to who you are. Now, I love most of what I do and my job in AstraZeneca. I enjoy the depth of the scientific discussion that I can have with the discovery teams, with the translational precision medicine, with the design of clinical trials. I'm surrounded by fantastic leaders, among them, of course, Jose Baselga, who joined AstraZeneca in January and is such an extraordinary visionary. It's very energizing to work with him on a daily basis. And I also enjoy very much the fact that you can have a strategy by which you start developing many of our medicines, not only for metastatic patients, but also for early disease settings, locally advanced, adjuvant, neoadjuvant settings in many tumor types. And by nature, I don't do just lung cancer. I do clinical trial development in many tumor types. That's also very energizing and exciting.
Well, it seems to me that the one thing that would be really great about your particular role as somebody who sees a broad horizon is being able to control the resources and the direction of things, at least in the senior level where you operate, that you have a lot of control over the surroundings and the direction of what AstraZeneca does. And when you're outside of an industry role, you have to negotiate with a lot of other stakeholders to make these bigger decisions happen.
It is true that project management and resource allocation is much more professional in the industry world compared to academia, correct? In academia, sometimes we have a tendency to define certain areas as priorities without the funding that goes with the works, correct? Like for some areas, we have champagne taste and beer money in academia. In industry, you will never survive that. You need to put the resources where the priorities are stated. And that's very refreshing. It's sometimes challenging, but it's very, very good for advancing ambitious projects. It allows for a much clearer accountability, and it is indeed a completely different way of working. What has struck me a lot in industry is how multidisciplinary is the development of any molecule. And when I say multidisciplinary, it's not just among specialties as we understand it in academia. It's truly about areas of competency, of knowledge, toxicology, CMC, safety, regulatory, translational, clinical. All these functions create an entire kaleidoscope of knowledge that is needed to develop a given medicine. You learn a lot from that.
I see. It seems to me that in the US at least, we are entering a time when a bigger bottleneck in our ability to achieve the best outcomes for our patients with cancer is based on practical issues of getting the best knowledge, the best testing, the best treatments out into the practicing community beyond the tertiary care centers. And we're less limited by our knowledge and the science. What are your thoughts about this? You have an international perspective. You've seen several different systems, and you're also at a position where you're trying to plan for the best treatments available, but the science and even the data may not be limiting how cancer is actually treated in the broader community.
Your point is extremely fair, and I think it's a very important perspective that you are providing there, Jack. I mean, we can develop a therapy that is immunomodulatory therapy that can be offered after chemoradiotherapy, but if we realize that in many countries or even regions within certain countries, chemoradiotherapy for lung cancer was not the standard, correct? So all of a sudden you realize that the heterogeneity of practice can become a real bottleneck for allowing the access to innovative medicines. And I think it's fair to say that we need to pay attention, that we don't live in an illusion by which we believe that we are putting the lenses of academic reality towards a much more heterogeneous and complex reality that is very different from one country to another. I agree with you that in the US there is a lot of community based care where significant improvements need to be made. And I think it's a duty for all stakeholders to reflect on how can we take care of the obstacles that prevent the best possible care in many places. And when we say the best possible care, sometimes it's just starting by testing molecular alterations that are very well known in certain areas. And yes, we need to work together as the different stakeholders to make that better.
I know you've been interested in the developments of circulating tumor DNA from liquid biopsies, and that's a potential mechanism to address some of these disparities we're talking about. What do you think are the biggest advantages of this technology? Is it primarily the ability to get molecular data in patients in whom we don't have enough tissue? Is it a potentially faster turnaround time with a liquid biopsy? Or do you envision that it's totally going to change how we practice and that we'll be doing serial testing to modify our treatment approaches and select or deselect patients for adjuvant therapy and not too far from now?
I think it's all of them, Jack. I think one of the most important advances of the last 10 years is indeed the technological acceleration that has allowed now to detecting ctDNA molecular events and notably mutations at very low frequency, at zero point 0.1, zero point 0.2 allelic fractions frequency, which is very, very low. And we're getting closer and closer to the capability to detect a lesion in the body that will be 1 by 1 by 1 centimeter, correct? That will change everything for early diagnosis, for identification of high risk patients post surgery, for identification of patients who got optimal therapy of resectable disease, and you can identify them when they become metastatic even before the CT scans show that. And as you say, I think molecular monitoring in the blood of specific genetic events is through cancer biomarker analysis is what we used to call cancer markers like CA125 or CEA were not specific. The certain mutations can be very, very specific, and therefore longitudinal monitoring of the evolution of the clonal structure of a tumor is going to be a very powerful tool that will allow to identify the appearance of mechanism of resistance, to anticipate the need for a combination or change of therapy. And the cost is decreasing massively. And I really think liquid biopsies are completely going to change how we do oncology. And as you say, for patients who are in the middle of nowhere, where getting a new biopsy is so complicating, having someone to travel from the middle of an underserved area, get the person into a plane or travel by car for hours is such a difficult exercise. But the patient going to a lab and just giving a few mLs of blood and that tube being shipped and then analyzed is going to unlock so many possibilities for these patients anywhere in the world. I mean, it's a little bit like the iPhone, correct? Who allows someone in the middle of the high mountains in Bolivia to have his own bank account and to even take a picture of something he has in the skin, and an algorithm can tell you if it is melanoma without consultation to a dermatologist. Well, these people can have access to a blood draw almost everywhere and then can have a molecular reality described. It doesn't solve all the problems, but it's already one very important step forward.
Absolutely. I do think that we really need to address the cost issues that would have to come down. I think that is going to be a limiting factor as much as the technology, and that I see a great appeal. And I'm very impressed by how convergent the data are in showing the predictive utility of ctDNA in terms of who is likely to have a subsequent relapse after surgery and who is seemingly responding well versus more prone to have progression on a given systemic therapy and advanced disease. But it's hard to envision replacing CT scans that cost a few $100s with serial blood tests that cost an order of magnitude more than that. And I think we need to address that challenge before we can envision widely incorporating ctDNA into our treatment flow.
I am aligned with you. I truly believe it's going to happen. I mean, as we have seen the cost of sequencing collapse over the years, remember how much money was needed for the sequencing of the first genome. And today you can do a whole genome sequencing for $3,000 to $5,000. So this has changed, and it's going to change for liquid biopsies. And I really think it's going to be one of the big drivers of better care, earlier detection of disease, better selection of the patients who need adjuvant therapy, because as you know, we overtreat many patients after surgery because we cannot disentangle those who will relapse from those who will not relapse. I think it's going to be a very powerful driver of improvement.
Absolutely. And I think if it can significantly improve that turnaround time issue, I think one of the real issues we face in practice in the US and very probably in other parts of the world is when tissue NGS takes at least 3, sometimes 4 or more weeks to get the results back, and you have a patient in the exam room with you who you really want to get started on some form of systemic therapy within the month, as many biomarkers as we now have that would really make multiplex testing so valuable, we do feel some compulsion to also be timely as well as comprehensive.
I am aligned with you. And, we have pushed very aggressively at AstraZeneca blood TMB, and we share some of these results at ACR. And it's extraordinary how well correlated blood TMB is with tissue TMB. So that yet is another very important element for me that makes me very confident on the blood as a very good surrogate of the reality of the tissue.
Finally, I'm gratified to have been there with you when you signed up on Twitter, and you've done great things with it since then and have become really among the most influential, respected people in the field who's commenting on Twitter. But that has by necessity changed in terms of what you can comment on Twitter since you have taken a position with AstraZeneca. Can you talk about what Twitter is to you now in terms of both what you can share and whether you get any useful information out of other conversations going on that even if you can't participate in might be valuable to you?
Absolutely, Jack. I will be forever grateful to you and Charles Verte, who in March 2012 pushed me very, very hard to create my handle. In fact, you created my handle, as I remember where we were together at an ASCO committee meeting. And since I joined the industry, I can no longer tweet on any medication, correct? This is FDA regulation. So my tweets have become very scientifically focused, very much about mechanism of action, class of action, translational science. And I enjoy a lot sharing what I think is relevant publications. I think key opinion leaders or important stakeholders in pharma, we have a duty to our colleagues to highlight which are the important publications we see. People are frequently overwhelmed by the amount of publications out there. So giving a little help in the triage of what is really a signal versus the noise is fundamental. And I use myself Twitter for that. I follow very talented people, much more talented than me, that also tweet on key topics. It allows me to screen. I frequently no longer we go through the table of contents of multiple journals because my Twitter feed tells me what's going on in most of the key journals. And when I'm in a meeting, it's so energizing to have a Twitter feed that is telling you what's going on in the room next to you or in the other side of the convention center.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time, Jean-Charles. I look forward to connecting with you at a future meeting. I wish you all the best. Thanks.
Thank you, Jack. Same for you. And it has been an immense privilege for me to have this conversation today with you.
Take care. Thanks for listening. The West Wind Podcast is a Beacon Medical Interchange production with sound engineering and distribution by Mark Lindsay of Talking Speaker. We hope you'll be motivated to subscribe, whether at BeaconMedIC.com, through iTunes, or through another podcast service. Please also rate it, and I hope you'll be inclined to tell friends and colleagues in real life and on social media. We're always happy to get your suggestions and other input at westwindpodcast@gmail.com. Talk to you again soon.